The wind slipped through the bare trees, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and a chill that settled deep into the bones. On the eastern edge of Bristol, where the city slowly gave way to sprawling fields and aging wooden fences, a narrow path led down to a quiet patch of land, a place so still that even birds rarely crossed overhead this time of year. At the end of that path stood the rescue center. A rusted iron sign hung from a weathered wooden frame, its letters nearly swallowed by moss and time. Windhaven Animal Shelter, it read, or once had. Inside, the layout was modest. A few low-roofed sheds with corrugated metal panels, no more than 3 rows of kennels, a small administrative office, and a patch of earth in the back meant for walking dogs when the weather allowed. But on days like these, when the fog refused to lift, and the sun was little more than a whisper behind sheets of leaden clouds, even that ground lay cold and torn, a field of brittle grass waiting for something to change. Not many visitors came in winter, and those who did rarely stayed. They would drift past the kennels, eyes flicking over the animals behind the bars, then leave. Quietly. Quickly. The shelter had a smell of its own, not foul, exactly, but a strange mix of damp fur, soggy hay, and time trapped in a space untouched by laughter. The barking never stopped completely. It came in scattered bursts, as if to fill the silence between the staff's brief and broken conversations. Inside the office, a small space heater rattled faintly, doing its best to keep the room above 10 degrees. On the bulletin board hung a sun-faded photograph, staff and dogs posed under a summer sky 3 years gone. Next to it, a wall calendar marked feeding schedules, medical checks, photo days. Some names had been crossed out so many times the ink had all but disappeared. One of those names was Max. The last kennel on the left, the one where the yellow light barely reached, was always kept shut. That was where Max stayed. And almost no one lingered near it longer than 10 seconds. Not because he was aggressive, not at all. It was because Max did nothing. He didn't bark, didn't run to the gate, didn't press his face to the bars like the other dogs. He simply lay there, in the corner, curled into himself, as if even breathing was something he had learned to ration. In the pale winter glow, on a cement floor that never warmed, Max became almost part of the background, a quiet shape absorbed by shadows. A presence so still it blended in like furniture no one noticed anymore. Outside, snow had begun to fall, not thick, but steady. A fine white layer settled over the rusted roofs, wrapping the shelter in a broken gray stillness, one that bit through the skin and settled deep in the chest. In a place where everything was meant to be chosen, whatever did not shine was simply left behind. And among the forgotten lived a creature who had learned to exist without being called by name. Max had not come here from the streets. He had once had a home. His former owner, a solitary man renting a small flat in the southern part of the city, was forced to leave after losing the ability to pay. On the morning he moved out, Max was brought to the shelter. Not as a goodbye, just as something he couldn't take with him. There were no tears, no warm farewell, only a colder than usual morning, a frayed leash unhooked in haste, and a folded scrap of paper with a few uneven words. His name is Max. He's good. I'm sorry. Since that day, Max had remained in the last kennel, a corner soaked in mildew and silence. Nearly 18 months had passed. Not once had he been brought out to see if he fits. Not because anyone forbade it, but because Max had stopped reacting. At first, he used to get up when someone entered, a small nod, a faint thump of the tail. Hope, maybe. But people walked past. They always did, choosing brighter eyes, straight posture, youth. Within weeks, Max no longer rose. Within months, his tail stopped wagging, and by the winter of the following year, Max no longer lifted his head. Max was a mix, a blend of Malinois and German Shepherd. Once people had looked at him and thought he would be easy to train, sharp, a natural working dog. But what remained now was a thin frame, a coat once rich, now patchy and dull, a slight curve in his back, and eyes that had once held depth, but now sat clouded over, like rainwater sliding across a window long forgotten. One former staff member had summed it up best. "He doesn't care who comes or goes anymore. Nothing wakes him, but nothing frightens him either. He just exists." Max was never aggressive. He didn't growl, didn't bark. But he didn't play either, didn't wag his tail, didn't respond to food or toys. He simply stayed. There was a time a group of school children visited the shelter. They passed by Max's kennel. A little girl, no older than 6, held out a biscuit through the bars. Max gave her a brief glance, then turned his head away. The girl whispered to her friend, "That dog is so sad. Maybe he doesn't like people." But that wasn't it. It was simply that Max had learned a truth most creatures never should. Anything that came close would eventually leave. And he hadn't learned it once. He had learned it enough times that it became something deeper than knowledge. It became instinct. Like the stillness of animals in the wild, once they understood there was no escape. In his kennel, Max had one blanket, a thin gray one, frayed at the corners. No one really knew why he always dragged it back to the exact same spot, against the left wall, where the light didn't quite reach. Staff often tried to move the blanket closer to the front, into the warmth. Every time, Max would quietly pull it back into his corner. Maybe, in this narrow, silent world, that dark corner was the only place that still felt safe. In the internal behavior logs of Windhaven Shelter, Max's section was updated diligently at first. Notes, observations, feeding adjustments. Then the entries thinned. Eventually, they stopped. Not because people forgot him, but because, over time, nothing changed. Nothing at all. Sarah, one of the longest-serving staff at the shelter, had tried everything. She adjusted feeding schedules, brought in new chew toys, even invited a behaviorist to assess him. She remembered the first time she saw him. The way he looked at me wasn't like other dogs. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hope either. It was the look of something that had learned to expect to be left behind. A few months later, a group of young volunteers came to film an adoption campaign. They stopped at Max's kennel. One of them pointed and asked, "What about this one?" "He looks like a warrior." Sarah didn't answer right away. Her hand tightened quietly around the edge of her jacket. "He doesn't care who stops. You could stand there for 10 seconds or 10 minutes. It's all the same to him." No one in the group filmed Max. In the latest behavior report, Max's psychological evaluation was reduced to just 2 lines. No response to contact, no initiation of engagement. Beneath the printed notes, Sarah had added a line by hand, not official, but gentle in its insistence. "But he still listens." She recalled the stormy nights when thunder cracked the sky and set the shelter's dogs into chaos, barking, yelping, scratching at their kennels, but not Max. He stayed in place, unmoved, only his ears twitching slightly with each distant roar. Like someone who had lived too long in the heart of the storm, until even the fiercest noise became nothing more than an echo from an old dream. He ate regularly, not too fast, not too slow, but only when no one was near. Each time the staff set down his bowl, Max would wait. Not out of fear, but because the act of rising, of eating, seemed like something that shouldn't be seen, as though trying to survive had become a private thing, something fragile. "He's no trouble," one staff member had said, "but he doesn't expect anything either. Every day that passes for him, I think, is just one more day." In the kennel block, Where other dogs barked and danced and hurled themselves forward at every new face, Max's corner remained untouched. He was the silence in the room without light. The space people passed by, but never paused for. The winter morning began like all others. Cold, quiet, wrapped in a fog so thin and steady, it felt like a blanket laid over fading memories. A visitor stepped through the weathered green door of Windhaven Shelter. The doorbell chimed softly. No one noticed. The dogs nearest the entrance began to bark, their excitement rippling through the kennels in a rising wave of metal clinks, paw scrapes, and the scattered rhythms of hope looking for a face to hold on to. Max didn't move. He lay curled in the same spot as always, the far left corner, where the dull yellow light never reached. In front of him, the mesh door was smudged with dust and time. From outside, anyone looking in would see only a shape, a dark, unmoving shape, like a smear of ash caught between shadow and light. But look closer, and one thing remained unchanged. Max's eyes were still open, slow, quiet, watching. He didn't raise his head, didn't flick an ear, but his eyes, clouded now with age and abandonment, still shifted. Each time unfamiliar footsteps passed, they tracked the motion, not with hope, but with a memory, a distant instinct forged in a time when every sound outside the gate might have meant food, danger, or someone returning. Max no longer believed he would be chosen, but he could not stop looking, as if his gaze was the only part of him that had not yet been taken. "He doesn't hope anymore," Sarah had once whispered while standing beside his kennel. "But he still watches, not because he's waiting, but because he's learned to know when he's being left behind." So Max didn't bark, didn't jump. He simply observed with eyes that didn't welcome, didn't reject. Just eyes that once knew how to wait, but had long since let go of waiting. When the visitor walked by and paused briefly in front of the opposite kennel, a small dog wagging so hard it nearly slid across the floor, Max's eyes moved once more. Slowly. They stopped on the faint reflection in the glass door of the office. There was only him now in that section of the shelter. Not disappointed, not expectant, but still looking. Like an ember that had not yet gone out, not because it waited to be rekindled, but because the wind had not been strong enough to carry it away. The winter wind still lingered along the pavement, its damp hush wrapping around every corner of the street. In a small car coated with salt-streaked dust from the season, Rachel Donovan quietly turned off the engine. She didn't move right away. Her hands remained resting on the steering wheel, motionless, as if the fading warmth inside the car was the last thing tethering her to the grayness of the day. On the windshield, misted glass slowly gave way to watery streaks. Beyond them, the crooked sign for Windhaven Animal Shelter emerged through the fog. Bent, weather-worn, but still standing. Rachel opened the door. Her footsteps tapped softly against the stone path. The camera around her neck swayed gently with each step. A small sketchbook sat snug in the side pocket of her faded canvas bag, a thing she never went without since she'd begun to draw again. Since she'd begun, in her own quiet way, to live again. Rachel hadn't come to adopt. She wasn't ready for any kind of attachment. Not to people, not to pets, not even to herself. She was only here for reference material. A few candid shots of shelter dogs, for a painting series she was still piecing together, titled Figures in Waiting. Images of things left unchosen. That was how she had described it in her gallery submission notes. She had considered turning back at least 3 times during the drive, but for reasons she couldn't name, or perhaps because there was no reason at all, Rachel had kept going. The shelter door opened with a soft chime of worn metal, cutting through the noise in her head. A rush of cold air and the musty scent of animals met her immediately, hitting her face like an old, uninvited memory. The woman at the front desk offered a quiet smile, the kind that places like this knew too well. A smile shaped not by welcome, but by the absence of expectation. Rachel nodded back and gently gestured to her camera. "I'm an artist," she said softly, "working on a series about animals. I'd like to take a few photos if that's all right." No one asked more than that. No one asked why a stranger with tired eyes had chosen to come to a place like this, at a time like this. No one noticed how carefully she placed each step, as though even the smallest crack in the floor might make her turn back around. But Rachel didn't turn back. She moved past the first row of kennels, taking a few photos of the younger dogs, but her gaze never fully settled behind the lens, as if those tiny creatures were too bright, too alive, too full of beginnings. And she, still learning how to see the world in color again. Then she reached the final row. Her steps stopped. Not by intention, but because of a look. Not a paw scratching the gate, not a bark, not a wagging tail, just a look. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a whimper, just something that looked straight at her. There were mornings when Rachel Donovan woke in her third-floor apartment, not because the alarm rang, but because of silence. She had lived through days when the ticking of the clock was the only reminder that time still moved. Once, she let the hands slip 3 minutes out of sync, and the world kept going. That moment had stayed with her, the realization that she wasn't the center of anything, and that if one day she disappeared, the world might pause for 3 minutes at most, then quietly adjust itself and carry on. Depression didn't arrive like thunder. It came like dust, layer by layer, until you could no longer see light in the mirror. Rachel had lived like that for nearly 2 years, not drawing, not writing, not speaking unless she had to. Each day was a checklist of minimums. Drink water, take the pills, sleep for a few hours. She didn't cry. Crying belonged to those who still hoped for something. Rachel didn't. She had thought about dying. Not with drama, not in some tragic flourish, just as a quiet solution to the heavy act of continuing to breathe. One summer night, when the wind slipped cool through her open window, she stood at the balcony for a long time. A very long time. No one else was there. Nothing else but the wind. She didn't jump. She didn't cry. She simply turned away. The next day, she found a therapy center on the edge of town. She didn't go looking for help. She went to see if someone else had ever felt the same. A year later, Rachel began to draw again. At first, it was just scribbles. Then came figures with missing hands, missing faces, shadowed outlines with no borders. Slowly, the lines sharpened. Light returned. Not brightly, but like embers that smoldered in the palm of her hand, waiting to become flame. "Learn to stay," her therapist had once said. "You don't need to move forward yet, just don't leave." Rachel had no close family, no parents, no husband, no children. Her apartment held one bedroom, a shelf of half-finished canvases, and a reading lamp. On better days, she left the house. On harder days, she sat and sketched, or just sat. That day, the day she came to the shelter, was somewhere in between. Not good, not bad. Just a day that needed a place to go, a reason to carry a camera, and something faintly resembling the act of living. She didn't know what had drawn her to Windhaven. Maybe a post in an old Facebook group. Maybe the bark of a distant dog carried through her window one night. Or maybe it was something without a name. All she knew was that she walked into that shelter with a body no longer chasing an end, but still learning, minute by minute, how to remain. And sometimes, to remain, one needs a look from a creature who had stayed longer with that thought than she ever had. Rachel had taken more than 20 photos, puppies wagging their tails, older dogs panting in excitement, paws pressed to kennel doors, eyes wide and bright, as if trying to smile with every part of their body. But none of them had made her pause. Not really. Not until her footsteps brushed past the final row. No bark, no scratching, just a look from the dark. Max didn't rise, didn't move. But Rachel felt it. The moment her body passed the kennel, something inside her paused. Not because of sound, not because of motion, but because she had just walked past something different. Something that wasn't trying to be seen, but had seen her first. She stopped, turned her head. The dog's eyes were still there. Quiet. Not fixed on her in longing or hope, but with a look that had learned how people pause, just for a moment, and then continue on. But Rachel didn't walk away. She didn't call, didn't crouch down. She simply stood there, her eyes meeting his, letting the silence carry everything words would only interrupt. There was something in that gaze that made her unable to leave. Not pity, and not the so-called special connection that dog lovers so often spoke of. It was something else, because they were too alike. Both had survived the days when no one called their name. Both knew how it felt when a place once called home became nothing more than a cold memory. Both understood that continuing to live didn't always mean hope. Sometimes it was just a reflex. Rachel took a step closer, gently, slowly, with the careful grace of someone approaching a fragile thing made of paper. Max didn't flinch, didn't reach for her either. He simply watched, no trembling, no panting. And Rachel, for the first time in a very long time, felt no need to do anything. She didn't lift her camera, didn't jot a note, didn't silently plan which angle she might later sketch. She just let herself be seen. Between them stood the cold barrier of kennel bars. But the gaze passed through everything, through the long, unmoving days, through the quiet, unnamed panics, through the mornings when waking up felt like a question with no answer. "She doesn't know what he used to be," Sarah murmured to a colleague watching from afar. "But maybe she understands what he is now." For a brief moment, Max tilted his head. The dim light caught the fading gray across his snout. His eyes didn't sparkle like those of the dogs still waiting for homes. His eyes were still, but not gone, just like Rachel's. And in that quiet, two souls who had once believed they were no longer seen saw each other. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The room at the end of the shelter's narrow hallway was colder than the others. Maybe it was because few people ever came here. Maybe it was because it held too many things that had already been left behind. Not just dogs, but everything tied to hope or change. Rachel stood there for a few seconds after Max's gaze had found her. No one urged her forward. No one spoke. And for the first time, she didn't feel the need to ask, "What should I do now?" It was also the first time she chose to sit, not out of exhaustion, but because she finally had enough strength to wait. She lowered herself slowly, careful not to let her bag rustle against the wall. Her back touched the chipped white paint, cool to the touch. Rachel slipped her hand out of her coat and placed her bare palm on the cold cement floor, less than a hand's length from the bars of Max's kennel. She didn't exhale loudly, didn't speak his name, didn't reach inside. She just left it there, quiet, soft, like a wordless invitation that asked for nothing in return. The first few seconds passed, and nothing happened. Max remained still, his shape pressed into the floor like a shadow that had never learned how to move again. But Rachel wasn't watching the way his body lay curled. She watched his eyes. And what she saw was something most people missed when they focused only on the ragged coat or the silence. He was still seeing, not seeing out of hope, but because survival had taught him to see. To see was to stay alive, just like a wounded animal in the wild who had learned that sometimes awareness was the last defense between breath and oblivion. No one had told Rachel to do this. She wasn't chasing a noble act. She just remembered. She remembered a night on the balcony, standing so close to leaving, and how deeply she had wished that someone, anyone, would sit beside her. Not to ask, not to fix, just to stay. So now she did that for Max. No conditions, no expectations, no goal. Just a hand resting gently on the floor, as if it whispered, "I'll be here, as long as you're still watching me." And from that moment, something began to change. Not within Max, but in the space between them. The silence, once a husk of fear, began to soften. At first it was only the wind slipping under the door, carrying with it the cold breath of late winter's end. No one spoke, no barking, no signal that something important was about to happen. Max stayed still. The shadows in the kennel folded around his body, making it easy to mistake him for nothing more than a forgotten blanket. But his eyes, they had never looked away. Rachel's hand remained where it was, still, unshaking, free from expectation. There was only warmth and patience, and then, after a silence longer than anyone had ever been patient enough to hold, Max moved, not with a flinch, not in alarm, but with a slow, weary motion, as though his body had to remember how to operate each joint, one at a time. His back leg pulled in first, then the shoulders lifted, his spine arched into a fragile bridge. And he stood. His body trembled, as if the gentlest breeze might topple him. But he did not fall. Rachel said nothing. She didn't exhale sharply, didn't shift her hand. She did nothing that might disturb the thin veil of this fragile moment. Max took a step, then paused. For a long while. He blinked, his head tilted slightly. His ears, not quite flat, not quite alert, seemed to measure the entire world through the breath of the woman sitting before him. Then he stepped again. One foot, then another. Slow, soundless, each step shedding a weight of memory that had held his limbs hostage for too long. At last, Max's nose reached the bars. He stood no more than an inch from Rachel's hand. Silence. Even the wind held still. Everything seemed frozen in that moment. The moment a creature who had once lost all faith now stood on the edge of a choice no one had asked him to make. And Max chose. He chose to trust, not with a bark, not with a leap, but by lowering his head and resting it gently upon her open hand. Rachel closed her eyes, not to hide how she felt, but to let herself absorb the moment with every sense she had. She didn't stroke him, didn't draw him closer. She just left her hand right there, beneath his chin, like a space made to carry the weight of a soul that had finally dared to lean in. Between two beings who once believed no one would ever truly see them again, there had been a touch, and it was not skin that met fur, it was trust, reborn through stillness. From the far end of the hallway, footsteps echoed. Software, then halting. Sarah, the longtime caretaker at Windhaven Shelter, held a stack of folders in her arms. She had meant to stop by Max's kennel, to refresh his water and leave a bit more food, just like she always did. But when she turned the corner, she froze. The scene before her caught her breath mid-chest. Max was standing. Not from panic, not pulled by a leash, not startled by noise. He was standing, on his own. And before him, a stranger, not a staff member, not a vet, not anyone listed in the long log of failed reintroductions, sat quietly, as though that place had always belonged to her. Her hand still lay on the ground, still open, still waiting. And Max that frail, faded shadow of a dog who had been pitied but always passed over, rested his head there, as if he had known it was meant for him all along. Sarah couldn't believe her eyes. She set the stack of files down on a plastic chair by the wall. She didn't move closer, afraid that even the softest breath might shatter what was unfolding. Tears welled up, not out of surprise, but because it had been so long. The last time he stood up on his own, she murmured through the tightness in her throat, speaking more to herself than anyone else, was when his old owner brought him here and turned away. She raised a hand to her mouth, holding back a sob. Her voice didn't rise, yet it filled the space behind her. "The first time," she whispered, breath trembling, "he's touched anyone in nearly a year." Rachel turned her head. She didn't move her hand from Max, just offered Sarah a quiet glance, calm and steady. She said nothing, but Sarah nodded, as if between them something had been spoken without the need for words. "I used to think," Sarah said, swallowing her tears, "maybe he'd never do this again, not because Max was broken, but because sometimes you stay in the dark so long, you forget how to find the light." Silence followed. Only the sound of Max's breathing, steady, deep, warmer than any sound Sarah had hoped to hear. And in that moment, everyone present knew. No photo could have captured this better. That one gesture, the weight of a dog's head resting on an open hand, was the perfect sketch of resurrection. As Rachel walked away from the kennels, she didn't look back. But she knew. There were still eyes watching her. Not with longing, not with plea, just watching. Because it was the only thing Max had learned to hold on to after so many days of being left behind. The wooden door clicked gently behind her. Outside, the sky had started to dim. Gray clouds drifted low across the roof of the shelter. The scent of damp earth and cold air filled her lungs, leaving her with a hollow ache. She stood in the gravel-paved courtyard, the camera still slung across her chest, untouched. She hadn't taken a single photo. She had only meant to find inspiration, a few shots of dogs, a small project to ease herself out of the fog that had lingered in her mind these past months. But Max had not been part of that plan. He wasn't in the sketches. He wasn't on the list of easy subjects. He hadn't even looked directly into the lens. And that, perhaps, that was why Rachel couldn't walk away the way she had intended. She stepped toward her car. Her hand trembled as she reached for the keys. But the image returned, again and again, those lowered ears, that trembling posture, the heavy head resting in her hand, a wordless melody on repeat. "If I turn away?" The thought came softly, but it stayed. No one else might come. Not because Max wasn't worth it, but because no one else might have the time to look, the patience to sit, the silence, to wait for a soul that had fallen to choose to rise. Rachel leaned against the car door, eyes unfocused, staring toward the fence line. She wasn't sure she was strong enough. She wasn't sure she had the experience, the time, or the peace to carry a being who had once broken. But there was one thing she knew for certain. The way Max had laid his head in her palm, not begging, not pleading, made her feel more responsible than any voice ever had. "If I don't..." She couldn't finish the thought. There was no neat answer. Only a quiet decision growing slowly in her chest, like sunlight easing through a break in the clouds at the end of a gray afternoon. Silent, but impossible to ignore. Rachel got into the car, turned the key, and in the rearview mirror the shelter drifted farther and farther away. But the eyes that had looked at her never left. Rachel's front door opened on a pale gray afternoon, the mud tracks from her old car still fresh along the tiled path. She stepped inside first, holding the door open before turning back to welcome Max. The dog didn't resist, nor did he move on his own. He stood still as Rachel looped the leash gently around his neck. Then he stepped down from the car, slow and quiet, like a figure brought back from somewhere far away. Not heavy, but carrying the sense of something once swept off by the wind and only just returned. Rachel's house was small and unadorned, a neat kitchen, a living room soaked in soft, natural light, a faded sofa that had long since surrendered its color. In the corner stood her easel, a wooden shelf cluttered with sketch pads, graphite sticks, and half-used tubes of acrylic paint, some still uncapped from the last time she'd tried to finish something. She had already prepared a small space for Max, a thick cushion laid beside the window, a stainless steel bowl filled with water, a dish of warm pate stirred gently into dry kibble, still steaming slightly. But Max didn't look. He walked in without hesitation, but not with curiosity. He stopped in the middle of the room, as if awaiting a command that never came, then turned and headed toward the darkest corner of the house. No sniffing, no marking territory, no hesitant exploring, like most dogs brought into unfamiliar homes. Just a quiet shadow finding the farthest wall. Rachel sat on the edge of the stairs, watching from a distance. She didn't call his name. She didn't issue any commands. She only looked, her eyes resting on his back, sending out a silent message. You don't have to do anything. Just stay. But even that... Max didn't answer. No miracles happened that first day. There was no joyful leap into a new owner's arms, no trusting nuzzle, no grateful gaze or happy tail wag like the ones seen in those heartwarming adoption clips. Just an old soul in the shape of a dog, lying still beside a cold wall, his back turned to the open space around him. Rachel let out a quiet sigh. She hadn't expected magic, but to witness such complete stillness still pressed a weight into her chest. It was strange how the moment Max had laid his head in her hand had felt like a beginning. But now it seemed it had only been the breath of an ember, not enough yet to light a flame. She didn't turn on the lights. The muted afternoon glow was enough for them to see each other, even if only in the outline. One woman, recovering from depression. One dog, abandoned so deeply that the idea of someone returning felt like fiction. Two living things, under one roof, but not yet living together. That night, Rachel placed a second cushion beside her bed. Not too close, but close enough that if Max wanted, he could hear the rhythm of human breath, could feel warmth, not from a heater, but from life. But Max didn't come into the room. He didn't growl, didn't cry. He simply stayed away. He chose to lie by the kitchen door, where the tile was colder, farther from everything. His back pressed to the wall, eyes half open, like someone who hadn't yet allowed himself to sleep all the way through. Rachel left her bedroom door open. No coaxing. No calling. The next morning, the food bowl remained untouched. The warm pat had gone cold, stiffening along the rim of the dish. The water had lowered slightly, though it might have only been from evaporation. Rachel cleaned it out, then prepared something new. Boiled chicken mixed with mashed pumpkin, a combination most dogs were said to like, according to the vet. But Max only watched, not with hunger, not with curiosity. He watched as if weighing a question. Am I safe if I move towards this? Even the gentle tap of the spoon against the side of the bowl made his ears twitch. His gaze drifted away. Rachel said nothing. She cleared the bowl. Quiet. Unhurried. That evening she began to draw again, seeking rhythm through the graphite and lines. She set herself up in the living room, close to where Max lay. One hand on her chin, the other guiding the pencil. And slowly, from memory, an image began to form. Those lowered ears, the hollow eyes, the thin neck from the shelter. But the moment the first stroke touched paper, Max flinched. He jolted upright, didn't run, but instantly retreated into the corner, eyes wide, body rigid. Rachel paused, lifted her head. Max looked at her, not accusingly, but with a look she knew all too well. The look of a soul who had come to expect that every sound was the beginning of pain. She laid the pencil down. Didn't apologize, didn't comfort him with words or hands. She simply whispered softly enough for the air itself to carry it away. "It's all right. No drawing tonight." In the days that followed, Rachel tried calling his name each morning, just once or twice. Her voice was soft, never sharp, never commanding. But Max didn't turn. His ears didn't perk. His paws didn't shift. It was as if the name Max had nothing to do with the being that now inhabited his body, as if it had belonged to someone else, a different dog, long ago, a dog that had died in someone's heart and never come back. On the 6th day, Rachel sat by the window frame, her back resting against the wall. Max lay motionless across the room, still in the familiar corner near the fireplace, but never quite close enough to feel the warmth. She cupped a mug of tea, no longer hot. The steam clouded her glasses, blurring her view as much as her feelings blurred inside. She remembered reading once that love, when deep enough, could heal. But life wasn't written like books. Love, without time, without the right kind of silence, could become something else entirely, could become a weight. Rachel had never asked anything from Max. She hadn't called too often, hadn't tried too hard. She didn't press herself into his space. She hadn't flooded him with affection. She simply stayed. And she waited. But waiting was tiring, too. Not because there was no progress, but because she began to wonder, am I helping Max, or am I only deepening his fear? There were moments when Rachel believed she was doing the right thing, like the evenings she lay on the rug, reading quietly near the spot Max often chose. But Max would only glance once, then turn his head away. No approach, no reaction, no invisible thread connecting two souls with matching fractures. She had hoped, just once, for a tail to twitch, or for a blink timed perfectly to his name. But there was nothing. Rachel lowered herself, voice barely above breath. "I don't know what you've been through. I don't know who made you believe silence is the safest place to be. But here, you don't have to pretend anymore." Max didn't stir. Only the steady rhythm of his breath answered her, constant and even, as if ignoring the world was the last tool he had left for survival. Rachel rose. She picked up a small pillow and set it gently beside the cushion where Max lay. She didn't speak again, just turned away. Before stepping out of the room, she paused, like something had returned to her, mid-thought, and she said, almost to the space itself, "You can just stay here. No need to come closer. No need to prove anything, just be here, and know someone is waiting." No answer came. Only the whisper of wind through the door frame, stirring the thin curtain behind her. But Rachel's eyes didn't seek a response. She closed the door quietly, not to shut the room away, but to open a new stillness. A stillness where no one was required to respond on cue. A love without demand, a home without expectations, and a chance, fragile, small, but enough for a soul once collapsed to begin, slowly, ever so slowly, learning to trust again. Rachel never thought she would return to drawing this soon. After months of depression, The very lines that had once saved her had become what she feared most. Because every time she set the pencil down, it felt like looking straight into the pieces of herself that had fallen apart. And she wasn't sure she was ready to face them. But one afternoon, as the sunlight angled through the window and brushed across Max's back, his still form like a charcoal block dusted with time, Rachel felt a faint stirring in her hand. It wasn't inspiration, not the artistic kind. It was more like a survival instinct, like someone about to drown who breathes in, unsure if there's still oxygen in the room. She pulled out a pad of paper, sat cross-legged on the floor, roughly 3 meters from Max, far enough so he wouldn't leave, close enough to see every fold in his ears, every uneven patch of fur along his neck. The pencil she used was old, the tip dulled. But when Rachel lowered it to the page, her hand didn't shake. Because she wasn't trying to make anything beautiful. She was just breathing. The first lines didn't resemble Max. They resembled her weariness. A hunched curve of a spine carrying winter across its shoulders. A tail laid neatly, like the punctuation at the end of something unspoken. Ears not upright, but gently folded, like a being that had stopped listening to the world. She didn't draw from inspiration. She drew because not drawing would suffocate her. After 10 minutes, Max hadn't moved. After 30, he still hadn't turned away. Rachel drew 3 sketches, then set the pencil down. Not because she was finished, but because she felt lighter. She didn't know if Max understood, but somehow it was his silence, his distance, that gave her just enough space to face herself. No comforting gestures, no knowing looks, no words exchanged. Just a quiet dog, and a woman learning how to exist. One more day. In that stillness, their first drawing was born. Rachel never waited for a sign from Max. She just drew, each afternoon, bathed in slanted light, with a cooling cup of tea by her side, and a sketchbook that grew thick with rough, unfinished lines. Max remained in his corner. Still, almost indistinguishable from the floor itself. But one day, as Rachel lifted her head after finishing the last stroke, she realized he wasn't lying in quite the same place anymore. It was only a small shift, like someone had nudged the rug by a few inches. But Rachel knew Max had moved closer, not deliberately, not in a rush, but slowly, cautiously, like a fragment of silence testing the edges of safety. The next day, the distance shrank again, just slightly. And then, on another afternoon, while Rachel was sketching the curve of Max's right ear, she heard his breathing, closer than usual. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew he was sitting right behind her. Silent. Watching. The feeling pressed something deep inside her, not out of fear, but from a quiet surge of emotion. It felt as if a soul that had gone silent was gently saying, "I haven't left. I'm just seeing if you'll stay." Rachel continued drawing. Her hand was steady. She didn't look back, afraid that even the smallest reaction might make the moment disappear. Only after she set the pencil down did she whisper, "Do you feel a little better?" There was no response, only the steady breath behind her. But from that day on, Max was there for every drawing session. He wasn't there as a subject, not in the traditional sense. He became a presence, a quiet constant. Whether he lay still or didn't respond when she called his name, Max had made a choice to remain. And for Rachel, that alone marked a quiet but powerful turning point. That afternoon, the spring air carried the scent of wet earth after the previous night's rain. The window in the art room stayed open, as always, letting in the soft light and the gentle quiet. Max lay just a meter away from Rachel. This time his head wasn't resting flat on the floor. He held it slightly above, ears flicking now and then with each movement of her pencil. The sounds that once startled him, the scratch of graphite, the faint swish of charcoal, no longer frightened him. They had become part of the room's rhythm, part of the silence he had slowly begun to share. Rachel wasn't drawing his full form that day, not the still frame tucked in a corner. She was drawing his eyes. It was the one thing she had always avoided. His eyes had felt like closed doors, and she had never been sure if she was ready to step through them. But something felt different that day. She didn't fully understand why, but she knew she needed to try. Her pencil moved gently, tracing the slope of his eyelid. She paused at the center, at the pupil, where her own shadow, faint and blurred, reflected back at her from the page. She exhaled slowly. In that moment, she wasn't just an artist. She was someone trying to name a soul, to acknowledge its presence with the one thing she could still offer: attention. She looked at the unfinished drawing and softly said his name. Max. Just one word. One name. From the left side of the room, where Max had been lying in his usual stillness, something shifted. Rachel lifted her eyes. His tail, bushy and weak from lack of use, brushed gently against the floor. Not with certainty, not in a flourish. Just once. A quiet movement, like the first response from a heart that had nearly forgotten how. Rachel dropped the pencil. She didn't need to draw any more that day. Every part of her seemed to freeze, not from surprise, but from the weight of how real it felt. She didn't say anything more. She just sat there, eyes damp, her chest still, and for the first time in many years, she didn't feel like she was living alone. One name, one flick of a tail, a thread of light, fragile and soft, but no longer imagined. At first, Rachel didn't notice. She continued living in her slow rhythm, a rhythm she had learned only after walking through the darkest valley. Every action in her day was small, deliberate, and steady. She brewed her tea at exactly 9 p.m., turned on the warm yellow light in the corner of the living room, and sometimes stood up to grab a cookie late at night, just to feel like she was still in control of something. It was on one of those nights, when the wind slipped through the doorframe and soft jazz played in the kitchen, that Rachel got up. She carried a light sweater over her shoulder and quietly walked toward the kitchen, looking for something to settle her stomach. Then came a sound behind her. Not loud, not heavy, just a soft brushing sound, like fur sweeping gently across the wooden floor. She turned. Nothing there. But when she continued walking, the sound returned. Footsteps, quiet, distant but steady. Rachel stopped. The sound stopped too. She bent down and looked toward the hallway. There they were, those familiar eyes, watching her. Max was no longer sleeping the night away in a far-off corner. He was following her now, not closely, not clinging, but moving, silently, behind her. As if to say, I don't know why, but I'll be here. It wasn't a dramatic change. Max didn't come bounding with excitement. He didn't wag his tail furiously or leap onto the couch. But each night, step by step, he chose to follow Rachel. As if the habit of staying close had formed not out of training or reward, but from something quieter, something more human. One night, Rachel opened the balcony door and stood for a while, gazing out at the dark trees beyond. When she turned back, Max was there, sitting quietly at the threshold, making sure she wasn't alone. Another night, Rachel leaned forward at the dining table, exhausted from a faint spell that hit her earlier that day. Max didn't rush to her side. He didn't bark or whine, but he sat a few paces away, his eyes on her, watching. It wasn't noise that comforted her. It was his presence, just being there, steady, quiet, unshaken. Only a few nights earlier, Rachel had told herself, maybe I'm still living alone. But now, with a warm cup of tea in her hands and the soft sound of paws brushing behind her. She knew someone was here. No promises had been made, no bonds declared, just one soul stepping slowly out of the darkness, choosing to follow even the smallest trace of light. That night, the wind picked up. It wasn't a storm, just a cold breath winding through the trees, carrying the damp scent of rotting wood. Like winter hadn't fully left the outskirts of Bristol. Rachel couldn't sleep. There was no specific reason. Just one of those nights where the echoes of depression, like a thin mist, seeped gently through the cracks in her mind. She turned on the long sofa, pulling the light blanket up to her chin, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The living room was bathed in a soft glow from the table lamp. Warm enough to keep loneliness away, dim enough to avoid the glare of wakefulness. Max was still there, just a few steps away. He lay still, head resting gently on his front paws, eyes open, but not looking directly at her. Just like every night recently, he didn't sleep. He didn't leave. He was simply there. Rachel turned slightly once more, and this time she closed her eyes, not in the hope of falling asleep, but simply to let go for a moment. 1 minute passed, then 3. The soft ticking of the clock kept steady time. And then there was a warmth, faint but undeniable, like a gentle breath brushing the skin beneath her blanket. Rachel didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. Something had changed. Something soft, with just enough weight, was resting against her calf. It didn't move. It didn't press for attention. It was just a head, placed there quietly and without demand. Maximum. No sound, no warning. He had simply gotten up, approached her in silence, and, like an old reflex stirred from deep memory, rested his head against her leg. Not to ask, not to seek comfort, but perhaps as the only way he now knew how to protect someone he had begun to trust. Rachel slowly opened her eyes. The first thing she saw wasn't the ceiling or the soft glow of the lamp. It was the warm breath and the quiet, subtle rhythm of Max's body touching hers. She didn't dare move. She tilted her head gently, looking down at the rough, weathered head now lying across her leg. It wasn't heavy, but it was there. Present. Real. A sentence her old therapist had once said floated into her mind. When an animal that once lost trust chooses to lie beside you, it's not instinct, it's forgiveness. Rachel didn't know whom Max was forgiving. The person who left him, the world that forgot him, or maybe himself, for forgetting how to love. But she did know one thing. Tonight he wasn't leaving her alone. And for the first time in years, Rachel fell asleep. Not into darkness, but into a silence that no longer felt threatening. It was a silence watched over. The next morning brought no great change, no miracle, no sudden transformation. Max was still on the floor. Rachel still drank her tea by the window. But something had shifted. The air between them felt thinner, lighter, as if the space once filled with distance had now been warmed by a shared breath. Later that day, Rachel took her sketchbook into the backyard, where sunlight hit the worn wooden steps at an angle. Max followed her. He lay closer than before, not curled up in the shadows like he once had, but letting the light fall across his back. He wasn't basking, exactly, but he wasn't hiding anymore. Rachel drew a few lines, then stopped. The page felt too white, and her heart felt too full. Not full of ideas, but full of unsaid things. She looked at Max. He was half dozing, his head resting on his front paws. He didn't look at her, but he hadn't walked away. A thought passed through her mind. If it were you, you wouldn't judge? Rachel set the pencil down. She took a deep breath, like someone preparing to speak to an invisible audience. I didn't want to live anymore, Max, she said quietly. Her voice was small. She spoke as if telling an old story, not to seek sympathy, but simply to give the memory somewhere to rest. There were mornings I couldn't get out of bed, not because I was tired, but because I didn't see the point. Max didn't move. He remained still. Rachel continued, one sentence at a time, like a lullaby to her own soul. Someone once told me, keep going for the people who love you. But what if you don't know who loves you anymore, or worse? What if you don't think you deserve to be loved at all? She gave a small laugh. Not bitter, just tired. Max lifted his head. He didn't move closer. He didn't bark. He just looked at her, eyes deep and brown, steady and unblinking. And that look made Rachel pause, not out of surprise, but because she realized it was the first time she had told the truth to anyone in years, not to a doctor, not to a friend, but to a dog who had once been abandoned, who had once forgotten how to wait. Just like her, who had forgotten how to be believed in. I'm not telling you so you'll understand, she whispered, gently brushing her fingers along Max's head. I just needed someone to listen and not walk away. Max closed his eyes, not from sleepiness, but as if to say, I'm still here. And in that moment, a woman who once wanted to disappear and a dog who had once gone unseen sat side by side. They said nothing more, but the quiet between them no longer felt empty. That night, the wind blew harder than usual. A dry gust swept through the old cracks in the window panes, making the glass rattle with a faint, rhythmic tremble, like a whispered warning. But Rachel didn't notice. She was in the art shed, the small back room behind the house, patched together with aluminum roofing and plywood walls. It was there that she had begun finding pieces of herself again. On the easel stood an unfinished sketch. Max's eyes, half sorrow, half awake. Rachel had planned to complete it that evening. She had brought a pot of tea, a few sheets of paper, and an old electric heater that hummed beside the wall. Outside, Max was asleep. His large body curled beside the back door, shifting every now and then, as if adjusting his dreams. Rachel could see him through the window. The warm glow from the studio light fell gently across the dull fur on his back. Then, without a sound of warning, a tiny crackling noise broke the stillness, so quiet it could have been missed, like a wire kissing water. Then came the scent, the faint, acrid hint of something scorched. At first, Rachel only frowned, assuming the heater had overheated. But less than 10 seconds later, flames exploded from the corner of the room. One spark, then two. Then a searing strip of fire ripped through the shadows, devouring the easel, the paper, the thin plastic curtain by the door. Rachel leapt up, panic flooding her. Smoke climbed rapidly, thick and suffocating, like black ink spilled across the air. She coughed hard, stumbling in the red-orange glow, searching for the exit, but the door was jammed. The smoke flooded her lungs. Her eyes burned. She coughed again and again, reaching blindly for her phone, anything. But there was nothing but the choking dark. She dropped to her knees, not from pain, but from the sheer inability to breathe. It was only a moment, but it stretched endlessly. And in that moment, her mind whispered a single thought. So this is it. This is how it ends, and then, a bark, sharp, loud, close. The shed door slammed open with a force that didn't seem possible. Smoke poured out in thick swirls under the faint moonlight. Through the haze, a shape surged forward. Max. Without hesitation, without fear, he lunged for her, his jaws clamped onto the edge of her shirt. He pulled. Back. Hard. Rachel, half-conscious, barely noticed the icy floor beneath her body as she was dragged from the burning room. Her eyes fluttered open. Through the fog, she saw only one thing. A pair of brown eyes. Alert. Alive. Max was still pulling, still barking, still refusing to give up. The night wind swept across the snow-covered yard, carrying with it the heavy scent of smoke. Max had dragged Rachel out to the lawn. She lay on her side, drifting in and out of consciousness, clinging to each broken breath as if fighting against life itself. But Max didn't stop. The moment he let go of her shirt, he turned toward the house next door, only a few dozen meters away. A small home, always dark at night. It belonged to Mr. Walter, over 70, gruff, lived alone. But Max didn't care. He barked. The first bark, rough and sharp. The second, longer, louder, cutting through the fog like an alarm tearing at silence. Rachel exhaled in a ragged breath. She was still half lost, her face streaked with soot, her fingers trembling faintly. Max stepped onto the wooden porch and faced the neighbor's door. He barked again, this time louder, more urgent. His legs were trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion after the relentless pull. Still, his eyes never left Rachel. A light flicked on behind the curtains. He barked again. 4 times. 5. The wooden door creaked open. A frail figure peeked out. "What is it? Who's there?" Walter started to close the door again. Then he saw it. The flames. Smoke still curling up from behind the workshop. And Rachel, collapsed in the snow, with a large dog standing over her like a sentinel guarding the last breath of someone who mattered. "Dear God." He didn't hesitate. His hand went straight to his phone. The number dialed 999. His voice trembled but held steady. Max didn't understand those numbers, but he understood the sound of rushing footsteps, the tone of urgent voices over the line. And when the fire truck's lights pierced through the narrow street, he stepped back, sitting down right next to Rachel. He didn't budge. Sirens wailed, water hissed, voices shouted over the wind. But among all the noise, Max's bark had been the first sound, the spark that shook a night that had nearly gone silent forever. When the fire crew charged into the narrow alley off Clayridge Street, the flames had been somewhat tamed by the wind, but smoke still poured thick and dark from the scorched aluminum roof of the workshop, like a wound struggling to close. A paramedic spotted Rachel first. She lay on the frozen grass, shivering, her lips pale. But she was breathing, and right beside her, Max stood guard. No barking, no growling, just standing, between Rachel and anyone who approached. "Is that her dog?" one firefighter asked. Walter nodded, his hands still trembling from the shock. "It was him." He pulled her out. "I saw it. He barked until I came out." Max scanned each face, neither panicked nor welcoming. Just a firm gaze, as if to say, "She's alive because of me. Now it's your turn." A medic knelt beside Rachel and began checking her vitals. Max didn't interfere. He stepped back, but his eyes never wavered. Not until they wrapped her in a blanket, not until they placed the oxygen mask at her lips. Only then did Max let out a quiet breath. One of the firefighters, after checking the scene, glanced at Max and turned to his team. "Unbelievable. If it weren't for him, this would have been a fatality." Another nodded and quickly jotted down the report. "Malinois GSD mix, rescued victim from fire, located and alerted neighbor." Just one short sentence, but it held everything. The next morning, Max's image appeared on the local news. The photo was taken in a rush, Max sitting beside the ambulance stretcher, eyes fixed on Rachel being treated, under the dim flicker of the rescue lights. The headline read, "Dog saves woman from blaze on snowy night." The story spread quickly. Some people cried when they read it. Others shared the article with captions like, "The world has never truly abandoned us, so long as we still have a soul like this beside us." But Max didn't know he was famous. All he knew was this: on that night, The girl who had once saved him from loneliness had nearly been taken by fire. And if he could do nothing else, he would stay, even if only as a shadow, among the ashes. Everything fell quiet after the chaos. The fire was gone. The smoke no longer twisted and roared. It drifted lazily now, like a wound gently wiped clean by time's calloused hand. In front of the scorched concrete, the place that used to be her studio, Rachel sat on the old wooden steps of Mr. Walter's house, a thick blanket wrapped around her. Max sat beside her. No one spoke. The old neighbor had gone back inside after handing her a cup of hot tea. The fire crews had left. Only she and Max remained, like two strangers once lost in the dark rooms of their own lives, now seated together on snow stained with soot. Rachel turned toward him. Max kept his eyes on the burned remains, the only space where she had once felt she truly existed during the long silence of her depression. But now, she didn't grieve it, because she still had the one thing that had kept her alive. She leaned down and ran her fingers through the thick fur on Max's neck, still dusted with ash. Max didn't flinch like he used to. He tilted his head gently, then turned his gaze to her. There was nothing bright in his eyes, but something had returned. Trust. Rachel pressed her lips together, then couldn't hold it in anymore. She dropped to her knees on the snow, wrapped her arms around Max, and laid her face against his silent coat. "You're not just a dog." Her voice broke, rising from somewhere deep inside her chest. "You're family." Max didn't understand what family meant the way humans did. But he felt the steadiness in her arms, the breath growing warmer, and the rhythm of her heart no longer racing in fear. He leaned in, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. A snow-covered night, among the ashes. Two heads leaned together, two souls once thought extinguished. And in that place, no one spoke of rescue or near death. They only remembered a single line that made its way into the morning paper beneath the photo of Rachel hugging Max. "It wasn't a miracle that saved me. It was a living soul who never gave up on loyalty, even after the world gave up on him first." News never truly slows down. But some stories, when told in the right voice, can make the whole world pause just long enough to listen. The day after the fire, the Bristol Echo published a small article in the Life and Local section. Malinois Mix pulls owner from blaze, not a superhero, just family. The accompanying photo captured a moment of quiet stillness. Rachel, wrapped in an old robe, sitting in the snow, holding Max close. Max wasn't looking at the camera. He was gazing off into the distance, as if standing guard over something more precious than life itself. No one expected the story to spread the way it did. Within 48 hours, the paper's website crashed from the surge in traffic. Soon, animal rescue pages started reposting the article, often with a single caption. "A dog once forgotten is now the reason a woman is still alive." Hundreds, then thousands of shares. Someone wrote, "I used to walk past the old dogs at the shelter. Now I feel like I need to go back." Another shared, "I've survived depression too, but I never imagined a dog could understand that kind of silence." The image of Rachel and Max even appeared on an Italian website with the headline, "He didn't just save a life, he saved a hope." But it wasn't just virality, it was recognition. People didn't talk about a Malinois Mix. They talked about Max. Just Max. A simple name, yet every time it was spoken, it carried a feeling too deep to explain. At the rescue center in Bristol, staff began receiving message after message. "Is Max still there? We'd like to send something for that dog. Is there any way to help other dogs like Max?" Rachel didn't read them all. She only opened one email from a retired veterinarian. The words trembled with age. "I used to work at a rescue shelter in Yorkshire. I had to euthanize over 20 old dogs. Nobody came for them. Max, he reminded me of all the names that were never called. Thank you for seeing what the rest of us were once forced to ignore. Rachel printed that letter and pinned it on the wall of her temporary studio, right next to her first sketch of Max. The one she had drawn from a glance that asked for nothing, yet stayed. It started with hesitant emails. A woman in Manchester wrote, "I've never owned a dog, but I've lived a whole year without anyone touching my shoulder. Not out of pity, not out of duty. Then I saw you lay your hand on Max's head. No waving, no asking. I understood that sometimes simply being there is enough to keep someone alive." A war veteran from Cornwall sent a handwritten letter. The script was frail, tilted, shaky. "I brought 3 dogs to a shelter once, not because I didn't love them, but because I no longer had the strength to love myself. I lived through war, but couldn't survive peace. The story about Max made me return to the shelter. The old dogs were gone, but I asked for another. This time I won't leave." A 16-year-old boy from Birmingham didn't write. He sent a 47-second voice note, static and fragmented. "I haven't told anyone that I once thought about disappearing, but when I saw Max, he felt like me. Sitting in a dark corner, not crying out, not asking for anything, just still here, waiting for someone to find him." Rachel didn't rush through these letters. She read them slowly. Every morning she brewed tea and placed Max on the edge of the wool rug by the window. She would sit beside him, open the printed letters and emails one by one, and read them out loud. Not for Max, but for herself, to hear something clearly. That out there, in this world, there are still many unseen souls who continue living. Not to be pitied, but to wait. For someone brave enough to stay longer than just a moment. One man sent an old black and white photograph. He was seated beside a senior dog named Jasper. The photo was dated 1989. "I'm much older now," he wrote, "but I still remember those eyes. When I see Max, I see Jasper again. Thank you for telling a story that people like me thought would be forgotten forever." A little girl mailed in a scribbled drawing of a dog and a woman with long hair. Below it was a misspelled caption. "I like Max and the drawing lady." Her mother added a note on the back. "My daughter used to fear animals after an accident. Now she's asking to volunteer at the shelter." Each time Rachel read something, she would go quiet. Not because it surprised her, but because it sank deep. She realized Max hadn't just saved her. He had saved her voice, the ability to connect. There was a time Rachel believed depression was a deep cave, that once you fell in, the outside world could no longer reach you. But it turns out there are beings who don't speak, but still know how to stay close, still know how to rest their head on your leg, right when you need it most. Rachel began pinning up those letters, those drawings, even transcribed voice recordings onto the wooden wall beside her temporary studio. And in the middle of that wall, she wrote a small line. "You didn't need to do anything extraordinary, Max. You just had to be there, so others could believe it was still possible to go on." That night, Max didn't sleep at the edge of the rug like he usually did. He moved closer to Rachel, laid down beside her feet, breathing evenly, like he was guarding something without shape. She placed her hand gently on his back, said nothing. Just thank you. With every part of herself she had nearly lost. Winter in Bristol had begun to pull back its snow, but inside the small room behind Rachel's house, snow had never truly fallen. There, light from the skylight poured softly over pencil lines, brush strokes, and nameless eyes captured in silence. Rachel no longer painted Max, not because his story had ended, but because he was still living it, right beneath her feet, every day. She painted other dogs now, the ones whose stories hadn't yet been told. The first painting. A jet-black dog with patches of fur missing from its neck where a chain had rubbed raw. Its ears drooped, but its eyes stared straight ahead. The second? A dog with no tail, but its head tilted, as if listening closely for someone calling its name. The third? A small, trembling figure curled in a corner of a kennel. Rachel titled it, "Waiting for Someone Who Won't Rush." She hung the paintings on the wall. No captions, no price tags, no QR codes like in a typical gallery. Just presence, just one small line written in black ink beneath each painting. "I was once there. No one stopped." Each piece told a story, not through words, but through the way the eyes were drawn. Tired, but not defeated. Silent, but not voiceless. Without hope, yet still present. When the first photos of the paintings were shared online, the responses didn't come from art critics or gallery curators. They came from people who had once known what it felt like to be left behind. From those who had once been the child, never picked, the woman never kept, the man never given a final word. One comment read, "When I looked at your painting, I didn't see a dog. I saw myself, at 19, lying alone in the emergency room. No one came, no one asked. I thought I had shut down. But now, I want to turn back on." Rachel began planning a small exhibition. She called it, "The Ones We Overlook." There were no human faces in any of the works, only dogs, caught in moments of trembling, exhaustion, silence, and sometimes waiting. At the center of the exhibition, there was only one painting that included text. "They don't need our pity. They need us to be patient enough to see what others don't." The night before the opening, Rachel stood alone in the empty gallery. Only the paintings, the soft golden lights, and Max surrounded her. This time, Max didn't sit still in his usual corner. He walked straight to the very first painting, the one of the jet-black dog in a rusted kennel. He stared into the drawn eyes, ears slowly folding back, as if something inside him recognized what was there. Rachel stepped closer and whispered gently, "You knew them, didn't you?" She wasn't expecting an answer, but Max did the one thing she had taught him. He stayed. That night, for the first time in years, Rachel wrote in her notebook, not to relive guilt, not to trace the shape of darkness again, but to mark something she had finally come to understand. Not everyone needs saving. Some souls only need someone to stop, and call them by the way they look back. The community library sat quietly on the corner of Willow and First Avenue, a worn brick building with a faded green awning, where children gathered after school to read picture books, and elderly patrons came every morning for their printed newspapers. No one had ever imagined it would host an art exhibition. No one, except Rachel. She chose this place not for its lighting or budget, but for its proximity. Close to the community. Close to those who usually wouldn't step into an art gallery. And more importantly, close to the ones who had been overlooked too many times. On Friday evening, the large reading room on the ground floor was cleared out. Rolling shelves were pushed to the sides. Paintings were hung with rope clips and simple wooden hooks, right at eye level. Not too high, never distant. There were no spotlights, just warm yellow light from round bulbs hanging low from the ceiling, like in an old kitchen where stories are shared, not performed. Max was there from the beginning. He was allowed to lie beneath the reception desk on a thin blanket. But he didn't sleep. His ears stayed upright, his eyes scanning the room, not out of suspicion but awareness. Rachel sat at a small table, labeling each painting by hand. Each one bore a short title. Waiting for someone who's not in a hurry. Not chosen, but still here. Once somebody, now no one. Alongside each piece was a slip of paper recounting the real story of the dog behind it, gathered from rescue shelters Rachel had contacted. No exaggeration, no dramatic wording, just the truth, often chilling in its simplicity. Left behind after owner was admitted to hospital. Lived with an elderly person. After their death, no one came. Was once named Buddy. No one remembers. Everything was in place by 5:52 p.m. The doors opened at 6. The first to enter was an elderly couple. The second, a little girl holding her younger brother's hand. The third, a young man wearing headphones. He stopped in front of the first painting, took off his headphones, and didn't put them back on. The air in the room began to thicken, not from crowding, but from silence. No one spoke loudly. No one chattered. They simply looked at each painting, at each pair of eyes drawn with deliberate, patient strokes, at each quiet story beside them, which made it hard to walk away. A woman wept quietly in front of the painting of a dog missing a leg. A child tugged on his mother's hand and whispered, "Did it hurt? Did anyone hug him?" The mother didn't answer. She only bent down and embraced her son, as if trying to shield them both from a world that sometimes forgets to care. Rachel stood by the refreshment table, observing. She wasn't an artist unveiling her work. She was just someone recounting what she had once seen. Max stepped away from his blanket, moving slowly through the rows of visitors. No one stopped him. No one touched him. But everyone watched. And in that moment, Rachel understood. The exhibition wasn't in the paintings. It was between the viewers and themselves. That moment when they finally saw what had long been forgotten, and chose not to look away. The first painting was hung right by the entrance, a portrait of an old dog, fur a mix of white and gray, his left eye clouded by age. He stood in the rain, belly soaked, head slightly tilted, as if waiting for a familiar voice to call. Beneath the frame, a handwritten note read, "Temporary name, Toby, left in a parking lot when the nursing center closed. No one knew who his owner was? No one asked?" People paused there. No one said a word. A young woman gently touched the note, then sighed. Not out of pity, but because something in her recognized something in him. In the right corner of the room hung a sketch that only showed half a dog's body, as if the other half had faded into shadow. The eyes were drawn bright and direct, facing the viewer. Former name, Rex. Dismissed from the K9 unit for not reacting fast enough. Chewed through his own collar when caged. Still slept beside the door every night. A veteran placed his hand silently on his chest, then bowed his head before the painting. He didn't need to read more. At the center of the room, Rachel had placed the largest portrait. It was Max, sitting still in the golden light of a window. It wasn't a heroic pose, just a dog, watching. Max, a dog nobody picked, lay motionless for 18 months in a corner of the shelter, didn't raise his head when visitors came, but he watched, as if waiting for someone to stop long enough. A young girl stared at the painting for a long time. She said nothing to her mother. She just picked up the small info card, read it to the last line, and smiled. Each painting was like a folded piece of time. No dramatic colors, no added glow, just dogs that were once not chosen, now seen if only once. Rachel didn't paint joy. She didn't add twinkling eyes or cute collars. What she included were scars, bald spots, ears drooped from long silence. She didn't try to move her audience. She simply showed them what had always been there, just unnoticed. A middle-aged man whispered to his wife, "I don't know why, but I feel like I'm looking at myself." At the far end of the room, Rachel had placed a white board. At the top, she wrote, "If you've ever been overlooked, write it here." Within 2 hours, the board was full. No names, no introductions, just brief lines, Shaky, awkward, but painfully honest. I was the kid no one came back for. I sat beside my father for 2 years and he never looked at me. I'm still here, and today I saw a painting that looks like me. In that small library room, those nameless dogs, those forgotten souls, had done something no gallery ever had. They touched the part of people we often hide the most. That afternoon, the exhibit neared closing time. Beside the information table, a library volunteer quietly stacked leftover flyers. A few final visitors made slow, thoughtful rounds. Rachel sat in the corner, carefully folding her unfinished sketch pad. Max lay still by her feet. He didn't flinch at footsteps or wag his tail at curious glances. He was simply quiet, as though he belonged to the room like the light, like the air itself. A boy entered. He came with his mother, a small figure with tousled hair, looking like he had just woken from a long nap in the car. He didn't run, didn't ask questions. He just walked slowly, as if searching for something he'd seen in a dream. Then he stopped in front of the painting of Max. The portrait showed the dog sitting by a window, the slant of light tracing a golden outline on his weathered coat. There was no dramatic expression, no smile, no heroic pose. Just a gaze, and the way he sat, like he had been waiting for someone for a very long time. The boy stood there, unblinking. A minute passed, then another. His mother gently tugged his arm, whispering, "Shall we go now?" The boy shook his head. Then he spoke, in a voice so soft Rachel had to step closer to hear. "Is this dog still alive?" Rachel froze. "Yes, he is. And he's right here." She pointed down to her feet, where Max still rested, head on the leg of a chair. The boy crouched low, not reaching out, not trying to touch. He simply sat, eye to eye with Max. After a while, he turned to his mother. His voice trembled. "I want to adopt a dog like him, even if he's ugly, even if he's old, because he doesn't need me to be happy. He just needs me not to leave." His mother was stunned. Then she pulled him close, holding him tight. Rachel didn't interrupt. She just looked up, from the painting of Max to the real Max beside her. And for the first time that evening, she cried. Not from sadness, but because she had witnessed what a long enough gaze could quietly change. A few days later, the boy returned to the local shelter with his mother. They didn't ask for puppies. They didn't ask for breeds. They didn't care if teeth were missing or fur was matted. They left with a one-eyed, limping dog named Chester, a dog no one had picked before. Until a boy had said, "I think he's been waiting for me." By 5:30 that evening, the sun had turned a pale honey color, streaming through the community library windows and casting soft light over the still-hanging paintings, each one like a silent mirror reflecting the things people often forget to see. No one said a word. No one needed to. When Rachel stepped onto the makeshift platform, 2 chairs stacked together, a wrinkled sheet of paper in hand, everyone left in the room already understood. This was not the end of an exhibit, but of something that had quietly stirred in them. Max stood at her feet. No vest, no ribbon, just a simple silver collar engraved with a tag that now read, "Seen." Finally. Rachel took a deep breath. She wasn't a speaker. She wasn't someone used to microphones. But tonight, she had to speak. "I used to think a painting couldn't change anything. I was wrong. Because sometimes what changes isn't the world. It's the eyes that look at it." She paused, turning toward the portrait of Max. It wasn't complex. No dramatic composition. Just a dog lying down, head resting on someone's leg, eyes closed, the corners of his mouth gently lifted, like an exhale of quiet relief. "I'm not a hero," Rachel continued, "and Max isn't a miracle. He just existed, in silence, in being forgotten. But he kept waiting, and I was lucky enough to see him when he still believed. A short silence followed. Then Rachel bent down and picked up the small board placed beside Max's portrait, the message she had written by hand, with every tear she'd once cried. The first time, it was for herself. Now, it was for every unseen soul still waiting. She held the board up and read aloud, slowly, word by word. They don't need pity. They just need someone willing to look just a few seconds longer. A breath was drawn in the corner of the room. Then a single clap, soft but steady. And then came more, a round of applause, not loud but full, like everyone had come to the same quiet realization. It was time to start seeing more clearly, not just dogs, but the people around them too. Spring arrived in Bristol with light drizzle and fresh moss creeping across the old stone walls. The rescue shelter on the edge of town, where wind once slipped through loose wooden panels and where Max had lain for 18 months unnoticed, now had a wooden easel set up by the window, and behind it sat Rachel. No one had asked her to return. There was no invitation, no expectation. Just one morning she appeared with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Inside were a box of watercolors, a notebook, and a small pack of butter cookies. "I'm not sure if I can still help in any real way," she said to the same staff member who once cried for Max. "But I can paint, and I can listen." He nodded. No words were needed. Rachel began with simple sketches. A three-legged dog tilting its head, waiting. A stray cat with only one eye, still cautiously licking the hand of a staff member. A pair of senior dogs curled up together, rescued from the same abandoned house. But it wasn't the technique that made her drawings different. It was the eyes. She didn't paint to make things beautiful. She painted so someone, just one person, might look a few seconds longer. Every weekend, she pinned her work to a wooden board just outside the yard, each with a small story beneath. He can't run, but he still steps out every morning. She doesn't have teeth anymore, but still meows when someone opens a can. We found them in the frost. They haven't left each other's side since, not even in sleep. Children began to stop by. Morning walkers began to pause. Some left a few coins in a small paper box. Others simply touched the glass of a frame and smiled. A month later, the shelter had enough to repair the door of the third kennel, the one Max used to sleep in. 2 months later, they bought warm blankets for winter. And during their first fundraiser, a woman drove over 2 hours from Wiltshire just to adopt an old dog she had read about in Rachel's Stories. It wasn't magic, just moments of seeing, moments of listening, moments of empathy. But when pieced together, they became real change. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, as Rachel was shading in the soft, folded ears of a dog named Daisy, a young staff member leaned over and whispered, "You know, we call it the Rachel Corner now. Any animal you paint, someone always comes to ask about them." Rachel smiled. Not out of pride, but because she knew she no longer painted to heal herself. Now she painted so these small souls could be seen, be called by name, and be given a chance. Max had no credentials. He didn't wear a vest labeled emotional support dog like professionally trained companions. He hadn't been taught to sniff out stress or press his head to a panicked heart. But everyone at the shelter knew. When Max was lying there, the world seemed to quiet down. At first, Max simply followed Rachel. He'd lie under the table while she painted. He'd wander out to the porch whenever someone came to view the artwork. No barking, no tail wagging, just presence. Presence that somehow slowed people down. A boy with severe social anxiety hadn't stepped out of his car in 2 months of therapy. That day, for the first time, he walked into the yard, just because he wanted to see the dog from the painting. A middle-aged man who had just lost his wife stood motionless in front of the portrait titled Maggie, 14 years at the shelter, still waiting. When he began to cry, Max didn't approach. He didn't turn away either. He just stayed there, and that was enough. Max didn't do anything remarkable. He didn't run out to greet people. He didn't charm them with over-eager friendliness. Instead, he chose to sit at the edge of the wooden porch, where the afternoon light slanted in through the open frame. From there, Max could see the whole yard, without stepping into anyone's way. People started to notice. That dog on the steps? I didn't feel anxious coming in today. I just lost my mother, but seeing him sit there, I didn't feel empty anymore. He didn't touch me, but it felt like someone understood. Some days, Rachel felt tired. Too tired to draw another stroke. She would come and just sit, resting her head against the window pane. Max would come over, not to make her do anything, not to fix her. He'd simply lie down beside her feet, quiet, steady, as if to say, I was once alone too, and I stayed. So maybe you can stay a little longer. One morning in June, a group of psychology students came to visit the shelter for a study. One of them asked, "What breed is that dog? He looks like a Malinois German Shepherd mix, but his eyes, they're different." Rachel smiled, running her fingers gently down Max's back. "He's the forgotten kind. But now he's part of this place." Max didn't need to understand every story. He didn't carry the burden of healing. He just needed to keep sitting there, not leaving, and becoming a part of the new rhythm of a place that was once just temporary. Now finally, a home. It was an evening like any other. No rain, no wind, no headlines or sudden sparks of inspiration. Just an ordinary night, like hundreds Rachel had lived through since Max came into her life. The room was softly lit by the warm glow of an old yellow lamp. The easel sat slightly askew, as always. Max lay quietly beneath the table, as always. No music, no conversation, just the whisper of pencil on paper and the sound of breathing, steady and calm. But Rachel knew tonight was not like the others, not because of something that had happened, but because of something that was about to end. This drawing wasn't sketched in rough lines like the others. It wasn't just about capturing Max's gaze or the way he curled under the sunbeam. It was a farewell. Max had changed. Gone were the thin patches of fur and the lost hollow eyes of that first day. He was still lean, still slow, still quiet, but the light on his figure now was something worth holding on to. Rachel drew Max standing in front of a doorway. Not a window, not a kennel, not the closed door of the shelter where he had once waited, but an open door with light spilling through it. In the picture, Max didn't turn back. He didn't look at the artist. He simply stood there, quietly, his back slightly arched, his frame slender yet steady. Light streamed in from the porch beyond, tracing a soft glow along his spine. It wasn't the kind of light you'd find at noon. It wasn't as tender as dusk either. It was the kind of light that only appears when a creature, once broken, once faithless, chooses to face forward. Rachel didn't cry as she drew. She didn't say anything to Max. She just laid each pencil stroke slowly, carefully, as if every line carried a piece of her heart. The painting had no defined background, no furniture, no yard, no trees, only Max and the open door. Because after all this time with him, Rachel had come to understand something. We don't need much to heal. Sometimes, all it takes is a door and a reason to step through. When she finished the final line, Max was still lying there, eyes half closed, breathing soft and even. Rachel whispered, "I don't know if this painting is a goodbye or just a reminder that you're still here, but I do know one thing. I'll always remember the way you stood in that light." Rachel placed the painting on the easel and stepped back. She didn't adjust the shading, didn't tweak the angle. The drawing felt exactly as it should. Complete, yet somehow hollow. She sat down at the table and turned over a small piece of paper resting beside the frame. Just an ordinary sheet, but to Rachel it was sacred. It was where she always left the final word. Over the years, she had written countless little notes beneath her paintings. Sometimes it was just the name of an old street, sometimes a passing thought, other times a quiet apology to herself for taking too long to paint with her heart again. But this time, the words came slowly. Not because they were difficult, but because they couldn't be written until they were truly lived. She looked at Max, still the same dog, curled quietly in the corner of the rug, as he had every night. No barking, no demands, no interruption, just existing, gently and steadily. Then Rachel wrote, "Sometimes what we need isn't someone to call our name first. It's someone willing to wait until we find our way back." She added nothing more. No signature. No date. Because like Max himself, those words didn't need validation. They just needed to remain. She framed the painting and placed it in a special corner of the room. A place with no harsh light, no dust, no noise, just soft yellow glow, the scent of old wood, and the quiet breathing of an evening where no one was in a hurry. She placed her hand gently on the frame. Not to hold it in place, but as if touching a memory, the kind you don't revisit often but never forget. Max shifted slightly, not because of her touch, but as if he sensed something had shifted. Rachel smiled. She didn't call him, didn't say a word. She knew he would come when he chose to. And that painting, with the open doorway, the light spilling in, and those simple words beneath it, was not just the last portrait of Max. It was a message, for anyone who had ever felt forgotten, that sometimes the world doesn't need to shout your name. It just needs someone to stay long enough for you to turn around and realize you've been seen all along. Max's story is not a legend. It's not a miracle wrapped in a single night. It's the journey of two souls, both once broken, a woman carrying invisible wounds and a mixed-breed German shepherd who had forgotten how to trust. But in a world that rushes and demands, Max taught us something deeply human, that the extraordinary often begins in the quiet. In the moments we sit with each other, not needing to fix or change, just to be. One look, one hand that doesn't pull away, one person patient enough to wait. That can be enough to change a life. The German shepherd, long admired for its intelligence, courage, and loyalty, is more than a symbol of strength. Through Max, we glimpse another truth: sensitivity, endurance, and the quiet power to heal and connect. May this story remind you to look differently at the older dogs, the ones not chosen, the ones who seem to fade in the background, because in their silence, in their lowered gaze, there may be a heart still waiting to be seen. Because love sometimes begins not with a call, but with the quiet choice to stay.